Hello, I'm Pastor David Hewitt of King of Glory Lutheran Church in Carmel, Indiana, and welcome to another Boost from the Bible as we delve into the depths of God's holy word at this time. Let us begin. It was just the two of us. Now that we were in our 50s, my wife Diane and I were going through our usual difficulties on New Year's Eve, trying to stay awake until midnight. What seems ironic to me is that as the clock ticked away on this last New Year's Eve, I turned to Diane and said, "Good riddance to 2019. The year 2020 just has to be a better year." And no, it doesn't. It really doesn't, and it isn't a better year, but a worse, or at least a much more difficult year in a lot of ways, as we all know. That all of our plans have radically changed reminds me of chapter 4 from the letter of James in the New Testament, in which James, the bishop of the church in Jerusalem, has this to say to his fellow Christians. "Come now, you who say, 'Today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a town and spend a year there doing business and making money. Yet you do not even know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life?' James goes on. 'For you are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wishes, we will live and do this or that.'" James might seem too harsh when he goes on to call such planning for the future arrogant, but he is eloquent in pointing out to us how we all just assume we have our lives under control, and suddenly something happens that ruins, quote unquote, everything. Of course, the year 2020 has been most terrible for those who have died of the COVID virus or who have lost a loved one to COVID. But there also has been the loss of jobs, the loss of businesses, the cancellation of many plans such as school graduations, proms, special group events of all kinds. Weddings have been canceled, even in some cases the cancellation of funerals. And there's vacations, and then there's all this loneliness. In this vein, I saw a Facebook post recently by a high school teacher, and I'm sure her feelings were shared by teachers in all grades. She had become emotional when she recently returned to her classroom to clean up 3 months after the schools were physically shut down back in March. She wrote, "But most of all, it was the activities and lessons that lay half completed around the room that really hit me. Lessons I'd planned, lessons I taught the framework for, lessons I worked through with the kids. The students would never complete them because virtual learning just wasn't the same. The true impact," she wrote, "of not being able to work with students face to face became obvious once I saw the room without them in it." Now keep all this in mind as we delve into Christ's preaching of the Beatitudes, the beginning part of the Sermon on the Mount in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5, and how what Jesus proclaims in the Beatitudes can be a big boost for us in these weird times. Take the first Beatitude, for example. Jesus proclaims, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Have you ever been poor in spirit? We all have, though sometimes we don't like to admit it. Shakespeare had his character Hamlet describe what causes being poor in spirit using the following words: the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, of outrageously bad fortune, that is. Who of us hasn't had, if not a really bad day from losing your job of many years, which is what one of my best friends just went through? Who hasn't, at the very least, had a good day turned bad because of something someone else said or someone else did, or because you put your foot in your mouth, or because something important just did not go your way? Our spirits can get down in many ways, for a lot of reasons, and very easily. Yet Jesus surprises all by proclaiming that it is a blessing from God to be poor in spirit. How can that be? Well, let's look at this a little closer by studying the very next of Christ's Beatitudes, where he says, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." That's another shocking thing Jesus proclaims here. What's so great about being in mourning, being in grief? Being in grief for the loss of someone close, or being in grief for the loss of something important in one's life? Well, first of all, Jesus knows something about mourning. He probably lost his earthly father, Joseph, to death. At the time of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus had seen many turn away from him. He knew the religious leaders of his day were growing to hate him for doing things like healing on the Sabbath against the law, and some of his teachings and doings they hated. Again, but why does Jesus say it is a blessing to be in mourning? Well, as Susan Mansfield has written during these COVID days, and we are mourning for normality. She writes, "For being able to get up and go to work and take our children to school and meet friends and visit family and take a walk down the street without having to worry about social distancing. We," she writes, "are mourning for the holiday we had to cancel, the concert we had been looking forward to, and so on." Mansfield acknowledges that these things are missing may seem small. These things we are missing may seem small, but, she adds, it's helpful to acknowledge that is what they are, losses, even small losses, the losses just to ourselves. I would add, let's also acknowledge our struggles to God as we pray to him. And not just about what the world calls big things, but what the world calls little things as well. Letting God know what you miss, no matter what it is letting God know what you feel that you have lost. And, it is an important way to acknowledge that God and not you are in charge. That's the advantage as well of being poor in spirit. It's being willing to show your vulnerabilities both to God and to the other people around you. The next beatitude continues Christ's strange sermon. "Blessed," he proclaims, "are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." This has been a difficult verse for many over the centuries to comprehend. But perhaps in some ways, we can understand meekness better during this COVID time than at any other time in our lives. Staying at home when we were in almost total lockdown, remaining socially distant, the wearing of masks, these are all fairly passive ways that we help one another. And they have been at least somewhat effective. We see clearly these days that meekness is a form of humility, one of the great gifts of the Spirit to us. A gift which acknowledges the damage we can do if we do something, shall we say, without God's permission. We often sin every day just by blurting out the wrong thing and or doing the wrong thing. As the old saying goes, discretion is the better part of valor. To be sure, Christ wants us to be active servants. For instance, he said, do unto others as you would have others do for you. But we must also realize that we can really screw things up in situations simply because we decided that we couldn't just sit there and be a quiet servant for a while. There are times when it is wise to stay away from others and schedule that argument later. So the stay-at-home orders give us a kind of metaphor for the laid-back way that we can serve others and we can be helpful to them. Now, these three Beatitudes, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are the meek, lead to the next one, a really key beatitude, the fourth one. Jesus exclaims, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Now, Christ's wording here is oh so careful. So let me read it to you again very slowly. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Now, what's going on here? I believe that's a perfect verse for our times. Why? Why do I think that? Well, it's pretty obvious that the most difficult time we will have during this COVID period is the one we are just entering into now. Whether and how to reopen various facilities and how to act as we reopen. Each one of us, have our own feelings on this matter. We each have read a lot of things. We each have our own concerns. Some of those concerns are the same and some are different. But we all would like to know how to do the right thing. What Jesus is very carefully saying here is that we should do the quote-unquote right thing, not as we feel like doing, but the right thing at God's behest, by listening to God in prayer for God's guidance for us. Notice two things in this beatitude. First, Jesus does not say, blessed are those who are righteous, which one might assume we should say, because isn't that what religion is all about? Being right? Jesus is not being religious here. He knows that true righteousness comes from God, not from our sinful hearts and minds. We do the best thing during these COVID times if we not only talk to God, but listen to God. And listen to God while being very hungry and thirsty for what God might be commanding us to do. Divine commands that are the real and only true righteousness in this world. Now, if we are quiet and wait patiently for God as we pray and listen to Him, we will hear an idea pop into our heads. We will. Usually an idea about how to be more caring and more thoughtful of others than we have been thus far. And also maybe an idea will pop into our head from God, how to not judge others as harshly as we have been doing. Also, how to avoid something that just makes us look good. These things Jesus gives us because we're hungry and thirsty for those great ideas from God. And then Jesus carefully ends this beatitude by guaranteeing that. He says, for those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, that they will be filled. As we pray and as we let God enter into our thoughts and calm our feelings, we are allowing God to fill us up with his love, fill us up with his peace, and fill us up with his joy. In fact, becoming so filled up by God that we can perform for others the very next beatitude, where Jesus says, "Blessed are the merciful." Down through the centuries, Christ's beatitudes have been debated for their meaning. There are, indeed, different ways to look at the Beatitudes. And sometimes what Jesus says will only come through in new ways for us in new situations, like the one we're in. We're living in strange times, aren't we? And these strange Beatitudes are very helpful because they are so strange. We are glad that God is there when we are in mourning for the loss of normality, and that God is there for us when we make room for him to comfort us, all the while admitting that we feel poor in spirit. We have been called to be meek as a society in ways we could never have anticipated. And that sometimes makes us uncomfortable, as though we had done something wrong. But God helps us to see the value of personal humility at these times. How being meek is being a good minister to others, for example. As we all let ourselves be hungry and thirsty, not for just any sort of righteousness, but hungry and thirsty for the unconditionally loving sort of righteousness that Jesus gives us. The same Jesus who, through his Spirit, is indwelling inside of us believers. That same Jesus who is continuing to fulfill and fill you and me. Fill you and me with great care and concern for others, and fill you and me with God's patience and God's peace. He will do that for you. Amen. Well, join us for another boost from the Bible next week, and may God continue to bless you.